Hello, welcome to Archaeological and happy Halloween. Halloween is a very important time of year for me and a lot of my fellow heathens in the heathen community, as it is a time to give offerings to our ancestors who have passed and other family members, as well as give offerings to the goddess Hel of the underworld for um, watching over our family members who are now residing within her realm. So, in honor of that holiday, I bring you a video about necromancy in ancient Scandinavia as it pertains to ancestor worship with ships and burial mounds. So, what is necromancy? Well, necromancy in layman terms, as you see on the video, is in essence the practice of communicating with the dead, often in order to gain things like insight, secrets, or to predict the future. Meanwhile, ancestor worship is a term that some people have heard of, but some people haven't. And it generally is the custom of venerating one's ancestors as they are still considered a part of the family, regardless of whether or not they have died. Something that I do definitely hold to, having lost family members, including one of my children. So these things are not so disconnected as one might think. In fact, they are very interconnected. However, most people, when they hear necromancer, they think of some sort of evil sorcerer rising the dead, an army of zombies or skeletons to fight some battle or wars for them, like the Horned King from Disney's Black Cauldron movie, rising as Cauldronborn to go conquer the realm, or this orc necromancer from World of Warcraft. And I also have to say that, side note, the books of the Black Cauldron were a lot better than the movie. The movie was pretty good. But regardless, these are the most popular kind of visions of what necromancers are. However, as always, history is a little bit different and a little bit less exciting. While maybe the idea of rising the dead in battle does show up in some historical and mythical texts, generally necromancy was more seen as a way to communicate with your ancestors for the aforementioned insight or predicting the future or whatever. So generally, necromancy would be done at graves, such as this burial mound. Burial mounds were by far the most common way people were buried in ancient Scandinavia. They were not, despite common, popular culture and misconception, burned in ships. That did happen, but generally the burning of ships was only in certain areas. Meanwhile, most people would be buried in those mounds, where it was believed that their soul did reside and they could communicate with the living, sometimes through doorways, which I will get more into in a little bit, or simply by sitting on top of the mound. Good examples of this in text can be seen in Njal Saga, where one of the main characters, Gunnar, now dead, can be heard singing and speaking from his grave mound. So oftentimes people would come to these grave mounds and sit on top of the mounds or by the doorways to speak and gain insight from their ancestors. And oftentimes, one of the things that was seen to connect these ancestors to the land of the living, despite my statements about the burning of ships, ships were still used, such as seen in the Sutton Hoo burial mound of Offa, one of the Anglo-Saxon kings. So ships were seen as a way for the dead to pass from the land of the living to the land of the dead. So they were very important ceremonially and religiously amongst these cultures. And oftentimes it was believed they could also travel back from the land of the dead to the land of the living on these ships if they were called upon. One good example of this is the burial at Austenberg, where a ship burial of two women who were found, and we're not sure what or who they were. Some hypotheses have been that perhaps they were medicine women called vulvas, or it was a medicine woman and her apprentice, or even a couple, two members of royalty. We don't know. However, what is interesting is that they were buried in a ship with certain religious trappings and ceremonial trappings, uh, generally suggesting that they could, in this boat, travel from the land of the living to the land of the dead and back. But what is also interesting is that the ship was found with a chain attaching it to the tomb. Now, some early archaeologists thought that perhaps this was to keep the ancestors of these figures' souls attached into the burial mound. However, more recently, archaeologists have begun to postulate that perhaps these were not to keep them there, but they were to give them an anchor into the world of the living, so that they could still pass from the land of the living to the dead, but they had this anchor anchoring them to their home from when they were living, to where if they are called upon by the living, they could return more easily to where they lived in life. And other similar examples of it like these have been found in other tombs, such as homes, little miniature homes that look like what perhaps the figures in the tombs lived in, which some again postulated that perhaps this was originally meant to be for the dead to reside in. But again, more recently, it's thought to be this sort of anchoring event where the dead could still go to the afterlife, but if they were called upon by a family member, they had that anchor in the shape of their home that they had lived in while they were alive, could bring them back to the living to communicate with their descendants. However, while these are important and interesting, the idea of ships as anchors and vessels to lead to the afterlife goes back to the early Iron Age and even the Bronze Age, where we see these megalithic structures in the shape of boats, where oftentimes cremation events would happen, where an individual or individuals was cremated with certain objects in these ships, which are not very clear on what direction the ship is going, which archaeologists use this based off of the evidence to postulate that perhaps they admit these ships could again travel back and forth between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And what's most interesting about these is they vary massively in size. So you see on the left a very large and very long example of this, to where large groups of people could gather in. We do have evidence of large ceremonies happening in these large ships. Meanwhile, on the right, you see multiple examples of smaller ships where only a small amount of individuals could enter for ceremony. So what archaeologists take based off of this is that larger ships were meant for whole communities to come and commune with their ancestors through rituals. Meanwhile, the smaller ones are meant for smaller family groups. And again, we do have evidence for this. We have evidence for rituals being done here, as well as cremation events. We have individuals who were cremated with swords and other items that they needed and were buried in these areas, in these megaliths, if you what have you. They most fit with megaliths, but there are also burial areas, which not all megaliths were. So, but that being said, these were used in necromantic rituals to communicate with the dead, and it just depended on the size, on whether it was the whole community or a familial group. What is also interesting about this is these stone ships would sometimes have ritual doorways, either directly on them. As you can see on the back here, you have what seems to be sort of a doorway for individuals to enter the stone ship, or around them. And this is interesting and important because doorways were seen as the borders between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And in fact, the Poetic Edda mentions the entrance to hell, not the Christian hell, hell as in Helheim, the land of the dead, where most people went in heathen religion, was a doorway itself. So these doorways were often used in these necromantic practices themselves because of this view. So oftentimes, like Hrap, an individual in Laxdale Saga, people would be buried in a threshold, sometimes at their choosing, like Hrap, so he could annoy his neighbors because he disliked his neighbors and was known as a rather cranky individual, or if they were important. There have been burials found at Burka, such as the so-called Elk Man, who were found in an entire burial mound, but where their burial mound was under the threshold of a door of a longhouse or a mead hall. And so, much like the mounds, it was believed that one could come to these doors and speak with their ancestors for the aforementioned insight. However, these could also come with a double edge, as it was also feared that if a sort of a zombie, sort of a vampire creature called the Draugr awoke in a mound, they could use these doorways to escape and cause harm. So oftentimes in burial mounds, particularly cruel or vicious individuals who had died, which is what is one of the criteria to become a Draugr, they would often break a hole into the mound after building the door to confuse the Draugr so that they couldn't escape using the doorway. So doorways were incredibly important necromantic devices. And even the Poetic Edda describes Odin seeking help from a vulva or medicine woman by the literal doorway to Helheim. So doors were seen as these magical areas across time. And they weren't just in the Viking Age. In fact, there are Iron Age things called picture stones that were found on Gotland. And they are in the shape often of stave churches, which, areas called stave churches, but also just doorways in general, because these were what the doorways of stave churches look like. So again, you have the symbolism of a doorway being a border between the land of the living and dead, but also oftentimes, as the one in this picture shows, these picture stones would be coupled with pictures on the top showing a hero or heroes or battle scenes, and on the bottom they would have ships and other symbolism of the sea. And so what it is believed is that these picture stones were one of these doorway representations for necromancy, but they were also involved in talking to the spirits of heroes, as there was evidence for very large hero cults in Scandinavia and also Anglo-Saxon England. Oftentimes heroes would be heroes or important figures would be deified or mythologized, like the figure who may or may not have become Beowulf, and Rolf Kraki from Rolf Kraki Saga is mentioned by Gregory of Tours, who was a Danish king named Kalikikakis, and then also the figure who became Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and Volsunga Saga is most likely derived from the Frankish king Sigebert. Both of these individuals were very renowned and achieved great things in life. So it makes sense for them to be mythologized and turned into heroes. So with that in mind, how would you contact these heroes? How would you ask for protection as you would a deity, and an ancestor? Well, perhaps it was these picture stones that were carved in the shape of a door so that you could bridge that gap between the land of the dead and the land of the living, and maybe gain some insight or protection from these past heroes. After all, heroes and warriors are very important in heathen practice and heathen religion. A good example are the Einherjar, who are warriors who die in battle and reside in Odin's Hall of Valhall. We don't know that for sure, but considering the symbolism of doors and the fact that these picture stones too are often found near stone ships, it makes sense that these have that connection with the afterlife and with necromantic practices. So with that in mind, necromancy is an incredibly important practice in heathen religion based off of all this archaeology. And it's all, and now because of all these items I've shown you, it is not some guy like the Horned King rising an army of skeletons. It is much more benign. It is essentially summoning your ancestor or ancestors or any kind of family member for advice and help, or just to talk to them. So very important, but not, mythical and kind of barely magical. At least this is what's based off of the archaeology. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.